The day Myrtle Sutton buried her husband in the hard, cracked earth of Colton County, Texas, not a single soul in the town of Harlan's Crossing believed she would still be standing come spring. It was the autumn of 1873, and the land her husband Declan had purchased with borrowed money and blind optimism sat on the far western edge of the county, where the soil was pale and thin as paper, where the creek ran shallow and bitter with alkali, and where the wind came down off the caprock so fierce and cold in winter that it could strip the bark from a cedar post. Old Tom Haskell, who ran the feed store in town, had called it cursed land. Reverend Pittock had said only that God tests those he loves most, which Myrtle had understood to be a kind way of saying she was in for tremendous suffering. And Calvin Granger, who owned the largest and finest cattle operation in Colton County, had said plainly and without cruelty, but without any softening either, that no family would make it on that stretch of ground, and that whoever tried was throwing good years after bad luck. He had said it at the general store, in front of 6 men and the storekeeper's wife, and Myrtle Sutton had been standing not 10 feet away, her youngest on her hip and her 2 older children pressed against her skirt, buying the last of the salt pork she could afford. She had not said a word. She had taken her package, gathered her children, and walked out into the October wind with her chin lifted, and her jaw set in a way that her mother, God rest her soul, would have recognized immediately as the Sutton look of absolute and immovable determination. Myrtle was 32 years old, brown-haired and brown-eyed, with hands that had already known hard work and a mind that had always been sharper than anyone in Harlan's Crossing had ever given her credit for. Declan had been a good man, gentle and funny and full of dreams that his body had ultimately proven too fragile to carry. The fever had taken him in September, 3 weeks after they'd arrived on the land, leaving Myrtle with 8-year-old Henry, 6-year-old Pearl, and 2-year-old June, with a sod house barely finished, a half-dug well, 2 chickens, 1 mule named Bartholomew, and $47 that needed to last until she could figure out how to make the land give something back. Most women in her position would have packed up and gone to live with a relation. Myrtle had no relations within 500 miles. Most women would have remarried quickly out of necessity. Myrtle was not opposed to the idea in theory, but she was not willing to hand her children and her land and her future over to a stranger simply because the situation was desperate. And so, she did the only other thing available to her. She worked. She worked in a way that frightened her neighbors and impressed her children and did not for a single morning, feel like anything other than what was required. That first winter was the worst of her life, worse even than she would later be able to describe accurately, because there were no words strong enough for what it felt like to lie awake at night listening to the wind, and knowing that the sod walls might not hold, and the food might not stretch, and the children's coughs might mean something serious. Henry slept with his boots on for 3 weeks in January, because Myrtle had told him matter-of-factly that if she called him in the night, he needed to be ready to move fast. Pearl, who was sensitive and perceptive and had her father's gift for noticing beauty in difficult places, drew pictures in the dust on the floor to entertain June, and never once complained about being hungry, even when Myrtle could see in the child's eyes that she absolutely was. They survived the winter on dried beans, cornmeal, 2 rabbits Henry managed to snare near the creek in February, and Myrtle's absolute refusal to consider any alternative. By spring, she had made several discoveries about the land that the men who dismissed it had never bothered to investigate properly. The soil along the eastern edge of the property, where a low ridge broke the worst of the wind, was not as depleted as it appeared. It had been overgrazed and neglected, but it had minerals in it that good topsoil didn't always have, and when she mixed in the wood ash from the fireplace and the composted leavings from the animals and dug the rows deep and planted the seeds Declan had packed in a tin box at the bottom of the wagon, things grew. Not easily, not abundantly, not that first year. But they grew. She planted sorghum because she'd read in the agricultural circular that it tolerated dry conditions better than corn. She planted turnips and sweet potatoes because they worked below ground where the moisture held longer. She planted a kitchen garden close to the house where she could haul water from the well every single morning without fail. And she grew tomatoes and green beans and 3 kinds of squash. And she preserved everything she could in every jar and crock she owned. The well deepened itself, in a sense, because the spring rains filtered down, and Myrtle found, by digging a small channel along the base of the ridge, that she could direct a thin stream of runoff toward the garden plot during the wet season. It wasn't irrigation in any grand sense. It was just paying attention, watching how the water moved, and putting her effort where the land was willing to meet her halfway. Bartholomew, the mule, turned out to be worth considerably more than Myrtle had initially estimated. He was stubborn in the particular way that mules are stubborn, which is to say that he had opinions about the direction and pace of work, but could be reasoned with over time. And Henry developed a remarkable rapport with him that allowed the boy to handle plowing duties that would have exhausted a grown man. Henry was small for 8, and then small for 9, but he was methodical and patient, and he understood very early that the farm depended on him behaving like someone older than he was. Myrtle watched her son become a young man over the course of that first year, with a pride that ached because Declan wasn't there to see it. The town of Harlan's Crossing was 11 miles by road and 8 miles by the cut through the eastern hills that was rough on wagon wheels but passable. Myrtle went to town once a month, always on a Wednesday, always with a list written on brown paper in her precise handwriting, and she traded what she had grown or made or collected for what she needed. She traded sorghum syrup for flour. She traded dried herbs from the kitchen garden for thread. She did sewing and mending work in the evenings by candlelight and brought the finished pieces in to the women of the town and was paid in either coin or goods, and she managed. The townspeople watched her with a complicated mixture of admiration and unease. There was something about Myrtle Sutton that made people feel slightly ashamed of themselves when they were in her presence, though none of them could have explained precisely why. She was never unkind. She was never boastful. She was simply there and functional and unbowed when the accepted understanding had been that she would fail. Calvin Granger heard reports of her progress through the county's natural information networks, which is to say through the feed store and the barber shop, and the occasional conversation at the land office. He heard that the widow on the bad land was managing better than expected. He heard that her eldest boy had a good hand with animals. He heard, in the second spring, that she had managed to sell a small surplus of sorghum to the feed store at a fair price. Calvin did not think much of this, initially. He was a busy man. He was 38 years old, a large man with dark hair going gray at the temples and steady gray eyes, and the particular kind of quiet confidence that comes not from arrogance, but from having worked extremely hard for a long time and having earned the results of that work honestly. He had come to Colton County at 22 with a small herd and a letter of introduction from a ranching family in East Texas, and he had built the Granger outfit from 40 head to over 1,000 through a combination of sound judgment, relentless labor, and the ability to learn from every mistake without repeating it. He was respected in the county. He was considered fair. He was not, most people would have said, the kind of man who said things carelessly, except that he had said that about Myrtle's land. He had said it without thinking, the way a man says the obvious when no one has asked him to be kind. He had said it as a statement of agricultural fact, not as a judgment of the woman. And then he had thought very little about it for nearly a year, because his own operation required his full attention, and there were always cattle to move and fences to check and men to pay and contracts to negotiate. It was the spring of 1875, nearly 2 full years after Declan Sutton's death, when Calvin Granger first rode out to the western edge of the county on business, unrelated to the Sutton place. He was checking on a section of fence that his hands had reported needed replacing along the boundary line between his northernmost pasture and the county road. The job took him most of the morning, and on his way back south, he came along the ridge road that overlooked the low bowl where the Sutton farm sat. He pulled his horse to a stop. He had expected to see scrub and failure, or at the very least the modest output of a person fighting a losing battle. What he saw instead was a farm that was lean and hard won, but genuinely, unmistakably functioning. The garden was green and organized in rows so straight they looked like they had been drawn with a ruler. The sorghum field, which occupied the broad, flat area between the ridge and the creek, stood at nearly knee-height already, and was a color of deep, healthy green that he associated with good soil, not with the pale, exhausted ground he knew that bottom land to be. There were pigs, he counted 3, in a pen that had been built with evident care out of cedar posts and wire. The sod house had been extended at some point, a new room added to the north side with a window frame in it, and there was a proper door with iron hinges. Hanging on a line between 2 posts was a quantity of laundry that implied a household functioning with organization and purpose. A boy was working the edge of the sorghum field with a hoe, moving steadily along the rows in the afternoon heat with no hat, and Calvin could see that he was probably 10 or 11 years old and working with the focused efficiency of someone considerably older. A girl sat on the fence of the pig pen with what appeared to be a book, reading aloud to a small child beside her. And there was Myrtle Sutton herself, on the far side of the garden, on her knees in the dirt, moving down a row of something with the quick, practiced motion of someone who has done the same task so many times that their hands have learned it independently of thought. Calvin sat on his horse on that ridge for a long moment and felt something shift in his chest that he did not immediately have a name for. It was not quite guilt, though it was related to guilt. It was the particular feeling of being wrong in a way that mattered, of having said something that was not a lie as you understood the situation, but that turned out to be a lie nonetheless, because you had not understood the situation well enough. He had said it could not be done. She had done it. He touched his heels to his horse and rode down off the ridge toward the Sutton farm, not at a gallop, not with any drama, but deliberately, the way a man rides toward something he knows he has to face. Myrtle heard the horse before she saw the rider, and she stood up from the garden row and pushed her hair back from her face and shaded her eyes with one hand. She was wearing a plain brown dress and a canvas work apron, and her hands were dark with soil to the wrists. She watched Calvin Granger ride across the flat toward her with an expression that gave nothing away, though her heart had picked up its pace in a way that had nothing to do with fear, and that she refused, in the moment, to examine. Henry had stopped hoeing and was watching too, with the protective alertness that Myrtle had noticed growing in him over the past year. Pearl had put down her book. Only June, who was 4 now and had no memory of a time before the farm, was unbothered, continuing to feed grass through the fence slats to the pigs. Calvin reined his horse in at the edge of the garden and removed his hat. This was the first detail that Myrtle registered, that he had removed his hat. Men did not always bother with that when speaking to a working woman on her own land, and the gesture landed with a weight it might not have carried in a different context. "Mrs. Sutton," he said. "Mr. Granger," she said, in a voice that was level and unhurried and told him nothing about what she thought of his presence on her property. Calvin held his hat in both hands. He was a man who knew how to speak in the context of business and was less certain in the context of apology, and he spent one full moment that felt considerably longer than one moment looking for the right way to begin. "I said something 2 years ago in the general store," he said, "about this land, about whether a family could make a living here." "I remember," Myrtle said. "I was wrong," Calvin said. It came out more simply than he had rehearsed it, though in truth he had not rehearsed it at all. "I was wrong about the land, and I was wrong to say it the way I said it and in front of others. I should have come sooner to say so, but I am saying it now. I am sorry, Mrs. Sutton." Myrtle looked at him for a long moment. The wind came across the sorghum field and moved the hair at her temples. The pigs made their quiet pig sounds. June said something to a pig in a serious, instructional tone. "You are the first person to apologize to me for anything in 2 years," Myrtle said finally. "I will accept it." Something eased in Calvin Granger's face. He nodded once, the way a man nods when he means it. "Your sorghum is coming in well," he said, because he needed to say something that was not still part of the apology, and because it was true, and because it was something he genuinely wanted to know more about. "It is," Myrtle said, and something in her voice shifted the smallest degree, toward a tone that was still careful but no longer entirely closed. "I found that the soil in the bottom responds to deep tilling in the fall. I turn it down 18 inches and leave it rough over winter, and then in spring the freeze-thaw opens it up further and the roots have somewhere to go." Calvin looked at the sorghum field with new attention. "Where did you learn that?" "I figured it out," she said. "And there was a pamphlet from the Agricultural College in Austin. I wrote to them and they mailed me information." He turned back to look at her. "You wrote to the Agricultural College?" "Yes." He put his hat back on and resettled it and looked at the farm again, taking it all in, and Myrtle could see him reordering his understanding of the situation in real time, recalibrating. "If you were willing," he said carefully, "I'd like to understand more about what you've done here. Not because I'm looking to purchase or interfere in any way. Just because I've been running cattle on county land for 16 years, and I have never seen this particular stretch produce the way it's producing, and that interests me." Henry had drifted closer during this conversation, still holding his hoe, and was listening with the frank open attention of a boy who has not yet learned to pretend he isn't listening. "You can get down off your horse if you like, Mr. Granger," Myrtle said. "I'll show you the garden." This was the beginning. Calvin Granger visited the Sutton farm 3 more times in that spring, each time with what he told himself was purely practical interest, and each time stayed longer than he had planned. He discovered quickly, in the presence of one of the most quietly intelligent people he had ever met. Myrtle did not talk the way educated people talked, with the kind of formal language that announced itself as education, but she thought with a precision and a creativity that he found himself returning to in his mind long after he had ridden home. She had solved problems on that farm that would have stumped men with far more resources, simply by observing carefully and thinking carefully, and being willing to try things that had no precedent. The channel she had dug to direct runoff was a piece of improvised engineering that his own foreman, a capable man named Das who had been in the cattle business for 30 years, looked at when Calvin described it and said he would not have thought of. The deep tilling method was producing sorghum yields that were, in Calvin's best estimate, 30% better than what good soil typically produced in the county. The pigs were thriving on a diet of waste material from the garden and kitchen that Myrtle had calculated with almost mathematical exactness, so that nothing was wasted, and the animals converted it all into meat and fat and manure that went back into the soil. Henry, who was 11 now and warming slowly to Calvin in the way that a careful, protective boy warms to a man his mother seems to trust, knew the name of every plant on the property and could explain, in complete sentences, exactly why each one was planted where it was. Pearl, who was 9 and had her mother's direct gaze, asked Calvin on his 3rd visit whether he had come again to look at the garden or to talk to her mother, and Myrtle said sharply, "Pearl," and Pearl looked entirely unrepentant. Calvin said that he had come for both, and Pearl nodded as though this was the correct answer. What was happening between Calvin Granger and Myrtle Sutton was not a simple thing, and neither of them was inclined toward simplicity. They were 2 people who had been independent and self-sufficient for long enough that the opening of oneself to another person felt like a risk that required careful consideration. Myrtle was additionally cautious because she was aware that she and her children represented, from a certain practical standpoint, a significant undertaking for any man who took them on, and she had no interest in being chosen out of pity or obligation. She needed to know and needed to feel certain in her bones that if a man ever looked at her again with the kind of love she had known with Declan, it was because of who she was, not what she needed. Calvin was cautious for different reasons. He had been engaged once, years ago, to a woman from San Antonio who had come to Colton County for a summer visit, and then gone back to the city, and written him a letter explaining that the distances were too great and the life too hard. And while this had not broken him, it had educated him thoroughly on the subject of what it felt like to invest in something that turned out to be wanting something different from what you were. He was not a man who moved quickly toward anything he could not afford to lose, and so they moved carefully. They talked about agriculture and soil and weather. They talked about cattle. Myrtle had opinions about cattle that were better informed than Calvin expected, because Declan had briefly worked on a ranch before their marriage and had told her a great deal about the business. They talked about the children, carefully at first and then with more openness, because Calvin found Henry and Pearl and little June to be genuinely interesting small people and was not performing interest in them for Myrtle's benefit. He brought Henry a good pocket knife on his fourth visit, the kind with a bone handle and two good blades, and did not make a large gesture of it, just held it out and said that a boy working the kind of hours he was working ought to have a reliable tool. Henry took it with both hands and the solemnity of someone receiving something of true importance, and thanked him with a formality that was slightly heartbreaking. He brought Pearl a book of botanical illustrations, because he had heard her mention wanting to draw the plants she saw on the farm, and had found the book at the lending library in town when it came up for sale. He brought June a small wooden horse that one of his hands had carved, which June immediately named Bartholomew II after the mule and declared to be her most important possession. Myrtle watched all of this with eyes that took in considerably more than she allowed herself to comment on, and felt something in her chest slowly, steadily, against her most careful intentions, begin to open. The summer of 1875 was hot and dry even by Texas standards. By July the creek was down to a trickle, and the ground in the unprotected areas was cracking in the heat, and 3 farms on the eastern side of the county had their wells go dry or nearly dry. Myrtle's well held because it was deep, and because the ridge above it provided shade, and because she had been managing her water use with a discipline that sometimes meant difficult choices about what got watered and what did not. She lost some of the kitchen garden to the heat. She did not lose the sorghum, because the deep root system she had cultivated reached moisture that the surface drying could not touch. Calvin rode out in mid-July to check on the farm's situation, something he was careful to phrase as a practical inquiry when he arrived, and which Myrtle was equally careful not to interpret as anything more than practical, though the fact that he had thought to come during a drought meant something and she knew it. He found her hauling water in the evening, after the worst of the heat had passed, moving buckets from the well to the tomato plants with a steady mechanical purpose that she must have been doing for hours because her dress was dark with sweat, and there was a weariness around her eyes that she was not allowing into her body. He got off his horse and took the buckets. Myrtle stopped and looked at him. "You don't need to do that," she said. "I know," he said, and carried the buckets to the tomatoes. They worked together until dark, and when the watering was done, Calvin stayed for supper, which was beans and cornbread and the last of the salt pork, and he ate it as though it were the best thing he had tasted recently, and Myrtle did not know whether this was politeness or truth, and found she was not comfortable with not knowing, which was itself a sign of how much it was beginning to matter. After supper, when the children were in bed, Henry in his corner, Pearl and June together on the wide shelf bunk Myrtle had built against the north wall, Myrtle and Calvin sat outside the sod house in the dark that was still warm from the day's heat and talked for 2 hours about everything and nothing. And at some point, the conversation stopped being about practical things and became about the kind of things that are harder to say. Calvin told her about the engagement in San Antonio. Not dramatically, but honestly. The way a person tells a thing when they want another person to understand a part of their history. Myrtle told him about what it had been like, the night Declan died, when she had understood that she was alone and that there was no arrangement she could make that would change that. And she had walked outside the sod house and looked at the sky and had one solid minute of terror before she had folded it down and put it away and gone back inside to her sleeping children and started thinking about what needed to happen next. 1 minute, Calvin said. I could not afford more than 1 minute, Myrtle said. He was quiet for a moment. The stars over the Texas Caprock in a summer night in 1875 were the kind of abundance that has no modern equivalent, so many and so bright that they cast something close to shadows. I think about what you did, Calvin said. What you've done with this place. I don't know how to explain what it does to me to think about it. I said it could not be done and I was wrong and I know that now, but I don't think even now, knowing you, knowing what I know about how you work and how you think, I don't think I would have predicted it. I don't think most people would have predicted it. It wasn't just hard work, it was some other thing. What other thing? Myrtle asked. Refusal, he said after a pause. Just absolute refusal to accept the conclusion everyone else had already reached. Myrtle was quiet for a moment. The wind was moving in the sorghum and it made a dry, papery sound that she had come to find comforting in the way that familiar sounds become comforting. Declan bought this land because it was what we could afford, she said. And then he died on it before he could prove anyone wrong. I could not leave it. That would have been leaving him somehow. Leaving the idea of him, the thing he'd wanted to do here. I couldn't do that to my children. They needed to know that what their father had tried to do was possible, that it was worth trying. Calvin turned to look at her in the dark, and Myrtle felt the look on her face before she turned to meet it, and something passed between them in that moment that was not a word and did not require one. He did not reach for her hand. He did not lean toward her. He simply held that look for a moment and then looked back at the sky, and the restraint of it was somehow more communicative than any gesture would have been. They said good night at the horse, practical and brief, and Calvin rode back across the dark land toward his own place, and Myrtle stood in the yard for a long time after the sound of hooves had faded. She did not allow herself to call it love yet. But she could not pretend it was nothing. August brought 2 pieces of news that arrived within 3 days of each other. The first was that the Colton County Land Commission, which had been reorganized under pressure from the new county judge, was revisiting several land grants and deeds in the western section of the county, and that there was some question about whether the title Declan had acquired for the Sutton property was fully clear. The second was that Hale Patterson, who owned the dry goods store and had been one of the 6 men present when Calvin said the land could not be worked, had taken an interest in buying the Sutton property and had gone to the Land Commission to press his inquiry about the title. Myrtle found out about the title question from Tom Haskell at the feed store, who told her in the particular way that people in small towns tell you difficult news, which is with a great deal of preliminary discussion of unrelated topics before arriving at the actual point. She drove home with her mouth set in a line and spent that evening after the children were in bed going through the tin box Declan had used for important papers and reading the deed 3 times. The deed appeared to be in order, but she did not know enough about land law to be certain, and she knew that Hale Patterson had enough money and enough town standing to make trouble for her if there was any ambiguity to exploit. She had not planned to tell Calvin about it. She had been careful, throughout their slowly deepening acquaintance, not to give him cause to think that she was cultivating his company because he was a powerful man in the county, and she was a vulnerable woman who might need protection. She had been so careful about this that she had occasionally been more distant with him than she actually felt, which she recognized was its own kind of dishonesty, but which felt necessary for her self-respect. But Henry, who had apparently developed strong opinions about the situation, announced at breakfast the next morning that he thought they should talk to Mr. Granger. Why? Myrtle said. Because he knows about land, Henry said, in the reasonable tone of someone making an obvious point. Because he's been here 16 years and he'd know if the title was clear or not. Because, Henry said and looked at her with Declan's eyes steady and seeing too much. Because he would want to know, Ma. Myrtle looked at her 11-year-old son for a long moment. When did you get so sensible, she said. I've been sensible, Henry said. You just haven't needed to notice it. She drove to the Granger ranch on a Saturday morning, with all 3 children in the wagon, because she had decided that the children's presence would keep everything properly in the territory of practical consultation, and away from anything more charged that she did not yet know how to navigate. The Granger ranch was a substantial operation, well organized and clean in the way that a place is clean when the person in charge cares about the details. There was a main house built of good lumber, long and low with a covered porch, and several outbuildings and a large barn that stood solid against the flat sky. A number of hands were visible at various tasks, and they all looked up as Myrtle drove in, with the particular attention that the arrival of a woman with 3 children receives on a working ranch. Calvin came out of the barn when he heard the wagon, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw it was Myrtle in the seat was the kind of expression that a man cannot manufacture and does not know he is making. Myrtle climbed down from the wagon and told him about the title question and Hale Patterson, with the same directness and brevity with which she had been telling people difficult things for 2 years. Calvin's expression went from something warm to something considerably more focused. He had a very particular look, she was learning, when he was engaged with a problem, a kind of gathering stillness. Come inside, he said. He had a copy of the county land register that was more complete than anything the Land Commission maintained publicly, because he had built his operation across multiple sections and had needed to understand the full land history of the western county. He went through it with Myrtle at his kitchen table while his housekeeper, a stout, capable woman named Mrs. Beaumont, made coffee and kept the children occupied with a plate of molasses cookies and an absolutely bottomless supply of small talk. The Sutton deed was clear. Not only was it clear, but the patent on the underlying section predated any of the claims Patterson might attempt to leverage, and Calvin knew the county judge, who had been appointed specifically to clean up the messy record-keeping of the previous administration, well enough to be certain that the judge would recognize a straightforward title if it was presented to him properly. Patterson is guessing that you don't have the knowledge or the means to fight a title challenge, Calvin said, looking at the deed beside the register entry. He's hoping the uncertainty will be enough to make you sell rather than go through the trouble, but there's no real foundation to the challenge. The deed is good. Can you help me make sure the land commissioner sees it that way? Myrtle asked. Yes, Calvin said. It was immediate and uncomplicated. Myrtle looked at him across the table. I want you to understand that I am asking this because it is practical and because you know more about the land records than I do, and not for any other reason. I know, Calvin said, matching her tone, which was careful and level. And I intend to pay you for your time, she said. No, he said, Calvin. It was the first time she had used his given name, and they were both aware of it, and there was a half-second of something that was entirely at odds with the practical conversation they had been conducting. No payment, he said more quietly. Not for this. Myrtle held his gaze for a moment and then looked back at the deed. All right, she said. It took 3 weeks to resolve. Calvin went with Myrtle to the land commissioner's office, not as an advocate presenting her case for her, but as a knowledgeable companion who made clear, by his presence, that the widow was not as isolated or as easy to push around as Patterson had calculated. The land commissioner, a new man named Webb who was trying to establish a reputation for competence and fairness, looked at the deed and the register and the patent record and told Patterson flatly that there was no grounds for a challenge, and that if he pressed the matter further, he would be wasting both his money and the commission's time. Patterson left the office red in the face and did not look at Myrtle as he went. On the way home in the wagon, with Calvin riding beside her and the children in the wagon bed, Myrtle felt something that was so close to joy that she had to look carefully at it to understand it, because she had been so long in the territory of endurance and determination that straightforward joy felt almost unfamiliar, like a room she had locked years ago, and was now unlocking to find it just as she had left it. "Thank you," she said to Calvin. "You would have managed it without me," he said. "Perhaps," she said, "but I am glad you were there." He looked at her and did not say anything, and what was in his face was something she recognized now, and that she no longer pretended not to recognize. The harvest of 1875 was the best the Sutton farm had ever produced. The sorghum came in heavy, and Myrtle had arranged, through Tom Haskell, to sell a significant portion to a feed supplier in Abilene who had been looking for reliable sorghum producers in Colton County. The pigs went to market in October and returned a price that was better than she had hoped. The kitchen garden had not only fed the family through the summer, but had produced enough surplus in tomatoes and squash and beans to put up 3 times the preserved stores from the previous year. Pearl was 10 now, and had appointed herself the official keeper of the farm records, a position Myrtle had invented for her, because the child had a mathematical mind, and had been doing informal calculations about seed costs and yield ratios since the age of 8. Henry was 12 and had started talking about adding a small cattle operation the following year, using the same careful, research-based approach his mother had applied to the garden. June was 5 and was reading, imperfectly but enthusiastically, from the books Pearl had finished, and could name every plant in the garden and several of the ones growing wild on the ridge. Calvin had supper with them on a Friday evening in October, after they had delivered the last of the sorghum. Mrs. Beaumont had sent a pie along with him, which was an action that was entirely her own initiative, and that the children greeted with profound enthusiasm. After supper, Pearl asked Calvin directly whether he was going to marry their mother, and the table went quiet in the particular way of a table when something has been said that everyone was thinking, and only one person was willing to say. Henry looked at the table, June looked at Calvin, Myrtle said Pearl again, in exactly the same tone she had used a year and a half before, and Pearl again looked entirely unrepentant. Calvin was quiet for a moment. He looked at Pearl with a seriousness that acknowledged the weight of the question. "That would be a conversation I'd need to have with your mother first," he said. "She says yes to things," Pearl said, "if you ask properly." "Pearl," Myrtle said, for the 3rd time, and this time there was an edge of something in her voice that was not entirely displeasure. Calvin caught her eye across the table, and there was a brief, contained thing that passed between them that was as close to laughter as either of them had allowed in a long time, and it felt very good, that small shared thing. He helped wash the supper dishes because the children went outside afterward, and it seemed natural, and because Myrtle's sod house kitchen was small, and the 2 of them standing side by side at the wash basin was simply the way the space arranged itself. They worked in a comfortable silence for a while, the sounds of the children outside coming in through the open door on the evening air. "She's not wrong," Calvin said, not looking at her, focusing on the dish he was drying. Myrtle continued washing. "About what specifically?" "About what I'd like to ask you," he said, "if I were to ask you properly." Myrtle set the pot she was washing back in the basin and dried her hands on her apron and turned to look at him. He set the dish down and turned to look at her. The kitchen was lit by a single lamp, and the light was warm and unsparing in equal measure, and they looked at each other with the full, unhurried attention of 2 people who have been looking at each other sideways for a year and a half and are tired of the angle. "You came to apologize," Myrtle said, "and you stayed." "I stayed," he agreed. "Tell me why you stayed," she said. "Not what I built or what I proved. Tell me why you stayed." Calvin was quiet for a moment. That was not a hesitation but a gathering of something that required honesty to say correctly. "Because every time I ride away from this place," he said, "I spend the entire ride back thinking about what you said and what I should have said, and wishing I was still here. Because I have been running a ranch for 16 years and I have not, until I met you, looked forward to going anywhere the way I look forward to coming here. Because the way you think, the way you are with your children, the way you look at a problem until it opens up for you, the way you said 1 minute and meant it, all of that makes me want to be a better man than I was the day I met you. That is why I stayed. Myrtle looked at him for a long moment with eyes that were very still and very bright. That was properly done, she said. He reached out and took her hand, which was still damp from the washing, and held it, and the simplicity of it, the plain warmth of his hand around hers, was so complete after so long that Myrtle felt her throat tighten in a way she had not permitted herself since September of 1873. I would not be asking you away from this, he said, nodding toward the room, meaning the farm, meaning the life she had built. I am not asking you to give anything up or to become something different. I am asking to be part of what you are building here if you would have me, all of it. The children, the land, the pigs, Bartholomew. Myrtle laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and that you cannot prepare for. It startled them both, and then Calvin was smiling, the full generous smile she had seen only a handful of times, and it changed his face entirely, made it younger and warmer, and Myrtle thought that Declan would have liked this man, which was a thought she had not expected to have, and that, when it came, felt like something being released rather than something being lost. Yes, she said. Calvin, yes. He leaned forward and kissed her very gently, the way a careful man kisses a woman he intends to take care of, and it tasted like the evening and the lamp smoke and the possibility of everything. They were married at the end of November, in the sitting room of the Harlan's Crossing Church, on a cold, clear day when the Caprock sky was the deep blue of good china. It was a small ceremony because Myrtle wanted it that way, with Tom Haskell and his wife as witnesses, and Mrs. Beaumont weeping happily, and the Reverend Piddock, who had spoken at Declan's graveside 2 years before, officiating with a warmth that suggested he was pleased to be in the business of new beginnings after so much time spent in the other kind. Henry stood beside his mother in a new shirt that Mrs. Beaumont had sewn for the occasion, and when the Reverend asked if there were any objections, Henry said quietly and clearly, "No, sir," which was not actually part of the ceremony but which made Myrtle's heart crack open with love. Pearl held June's hand throughout and cried twice, which she later explained was from happiness and not sadness, and that she could tell the difference perfectly well, and anyone who thought otherwise was mistaken. June wore flowers in her hair that she had picked herself from the dried stalks of the kitchen garden, small brown things that were not entirely appropriate for hair decoration, but that Myrtle had helped her arrange, and that she was enormously proud of. Calvin looked at Myrtle throughout the ceremony with the steady, unhurried attention that she had come to understand was his particular way of being present, fully and without reservation, in the moments that mattered. They said the words. They meant them. The town of Harlan's Crossing had opinions, as small towns always do, and the opinions were mostly favorable. There were a few who thought it was fast, and a few who wondered whether Calvin was doing it for the land, and a few who thought Myrtle was doing it for the security. These opinions were discussed in the usual places: the feed store, the barber shop, the front steps of the church after Sunday services, and then they faded the way opinions about private things fade when the people involved continue to simply be themselves and prove the opinions irrelevant. What was not opinion but straightforward fact was that Calvin Granger moved to the Sutton farm, not the other way around. He had a good foreman in Doss and trusted hands who could manage the cattle operation with his oversight, and he spent the majority of his days on the farm that had once been declared the worst land in the county, learning from his wife the things she had learned by doing, and bringing his own knowledge to bear on the problems she had not yet solved. The first winter they spent together was hard in the ordinary ways, and rich in a way that Myrtle had not known she was missing, the simple, deep warmth of not being alone in it. Calvin was not a man who talked when talking was not necessary, and Myrtle had always preferred action to noise, and so they worked side by side in a companionable quiet that was its own language. And in the evenings they sat together after the children were in bed, and sometimes talked for hours about the farm and the county and the larger world, and sometimes said almost nothing, and were entirely comfortable in the not saying. He learned the farm the way he learned everything, thoroughly and without ego, asking questions when he did not understand something, and doing the work himself rather than directing others toward it. He learned that Bartholomew required a particular sequence of harnessing to avoid sulking, which Henry demonstrated with elaborate patience. He learned that the pig pen needed to be moved every second season to keep the ground around it from souring, a fact Myrtle had deduced from reading the agricultural circular and from observing the behavior of the grass at the pen's edges. He learned that June had decided at the age of 5 that she was going to be a botanist, which was a word she had learned from Pearl and used with great frequency and total conviction. In the spring of 1876, Calvin used his knowledge of cattle and his connections in the county to arrange a small but significant expansion of the farm's operation. The question had always been water, the limiting factor on the property, and Calvin had looked at the creek and the ridge and the underground water table with the particular attention of a man who had spent years thinking about water on dry land, and had come to a conclusion. "There's a secondary aquifer below the main water table on the north section," he told Myrtle one evening, with a hand-drawn map spread on the table. "The creek runs shallow because the surface gradient draws it east, but underground it's different. There's water under the north pasture, not as deep as you'd think." Myrtle looked at the map and then at him. "You're saying there's a well site." "I'm saying there's a very good well site," he said, "and that if we put in a proper well on the north section with a wind pump, we can irrigate an additional 10 acres. 10 additional acres of sorghum at the yield she had established would change the financial picture of the farm entirely." They put in the well that summer. Calvin brought in a well driller from Sweetwater who struck water at 62 feet, almost exactly where Calvin had predicted. The wind pump, ordered from a manufacturer in Kansas and assembled over 3 days by Calvin and Henry and Doss, who had driven over to help, stood silver and geometric against the Texas sky and turned in the dry summer wind and brought water up from the earth as if offering a proof of something. Henry, who was 13, said it was the best thing he had ever seen. June said the sound it made, the rhythmic creaking, was like music. Pearl recorded the depth and date and cost in the farm ledger with the meticulous satisfaction of a person who loves a completed entry. Myrtle stood at the pump on the morning it first ran full and put her hands in the water and felt it cold and clear against her palms, and was not ashamed of the fact that she was crying, because crying sometimes is simply the appropriate response to the conclusion of a long and difficult thing, and 2.5 years of making something out of what everyone said was nothing seemed to her to warrant at least a few tears. Calvin put his arm around her shoulders, and she turned into him and let herself be held, which was something she was still learning to do without the voice in the back of her mind that said she should be standing on her own. He understood this about her and did not rush her through it or press her toward more than she was ready for, and this patience, this consistent, reliable patience, was one of the things she loved most fiercely about him. The summer and fall of 1876 were prosperous in the quiet, solid way that real prosperity feels nothing like what people imagine when they think about prosperity. No single dramatic event occurred. They simply sold more than the previous year, spent carefully, repaired what needed repairing, added what made sense to add, and arrived at December with a better position than they had started January with for the second year running. Calvin's cattle operation continued to return well under Doss's management. The Granger Ranch and the Sutton Farm were understood in Colton County as being effectively one enterprise now, and the combined economic weight was considerable, which meant that Myrtle and Calvin's voice in county matters carried a force that Myrtle's alone had not. She was careful about this, careful not to let it become a cudgel, because she had survived on the strength of her own judgment and did not want to confuse the addition of resources with the addition of rightness. In January of 1877, on a cold night when the wind was reminding everyone that the Caprock could still be savage, Myrtle told Calvin that she was going to have a child. She told him in the direct, plain way she told him most things, and she watched his face change in a way she had not seen it change before, something that was beyond surprise and beyond happiness into a territory that had no simple name. He put both hands on her face and looked at her, and then he pulled her close and held her in a way that was not careful or restrained or any of the things they were usually careful to be, and Myrtle held him back just as fiercely. Henry was 14 now, and handled the news with the mature acceptance of a boy who had been the man of the house for 2 years, and was now gladly relinquishing portions of that responsibility. Pearl, who was 12, made immediate and extensive calculations about the expected birth date based on information Myrtle gave her, and presented these calculations as a calendar notation in the farm ledger with the entry heading, New Granger, estimated. June, who was 6, asked if they could name it Bartholomew if it was a boy, and was told that they would think very carefully about names, which was a diplomatic answer that June accepted with mild suspicion. The baby was born in September of 1877, on a morning when the heat was finally breaking, and the sorghum was ready for cutting, and the sky was that deep, clear blue that came with the first hint of fall. He was a boy, large and healthy, with Calvin's dark hair and Myrtle's brown eyes, and they named him Declan after the man who had first stood on this hard ground and believed in it. And the name felt right in a way that was not sad but was something more complicated and more whole than sadness. Calvin held his son on the evening of his birth with a stillness that Myrtle recognized as the same quality of presence he brought to everything that mattered to him, that full and unhurried attention. And she thought that Declan, the first Declan, would not have objected to that name being carried forward by this particular child, in this particular place. Henry held the baby with the terrified competence of a boy who had been told by his mother that he could hold his brother if he was careful, and was being so careful it made everyone who watched him quietly laugh. Pearl declared the baby's head shape to be excellent and his complexion satisfactory and his lungs clearly functional, and wrote all of this in the ledger. June held him very briefly and said he was small but that she would take care of him, and this promise, made with the absolute conviction of a 6-year-old, she would keep for the rest of their shared lives. The winter of 1877 was cold and clear and full. The sod house had been extended twice now and had 3 proper rooms plus the kitchen, and the floors had been laid with wood, planking that Calvin and Henry had put in during the spring, and there were 2 windows on the south wall that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the main room feel, on good days, almost generous. One evening in December, with Declan asleep in his cradle and Henry and Pearl doing their lesson books at the table and June drawing plants in a notebook she carried everywhere, Calvin sat beside Myrtle on the bench by the fire, and she was mending, and he was working on the harness leather, and the fire made the room warm and the wind outside was the ordinary cold wind of a Colton County winter, and not the terrifying thing it had once been. Calvin looked at the room and the children and the fire and the woman beside him, and he said, "Do you ever think about what you said to me the first time I came here?" Myrtle considered. "Which part?" "You said I was the first person to apologize to you for anything in 2 years," he said. "I've thought about that a great many times." "Why?" "Because I almost didn't come," he said. "I had put it in my mind to come for months before I did, and every time I found a reason to wait, too busy, not sure it was my business, not sure it would be welcome. And then one day I just went because not going was starting to feel worse than going." Myrtle set down the mending and looked at him. "I'm glad you didn't wait longer," she said. "Me too," he said. "You know," she said, and her voice was quiet and considered, "when I heard you say it that day in the store, I was angry. I was too tired and too frightened for it to be a big anger, more of a cold anger, the kind that goes down into you and stays. I remember thinking very clearly that I would prove you wrong and that you would know you were wrong and that this would be sufficient." "And was it?" he asked. "When I came to apologize, was it sufficient?" Myrtle looked at the fire for a moment. "No," she said. "By then it wasn't about the apology anymore. By then I was too interested in you to care about the apology." Calvin turned to look at her, and she turned to look at him, and they were both of them smiling in the way that people smile when they are saying things that needed to be said, and it has taken longer than necessary to say them. "I love you," he said. He had said it before, but he said it then the way you say something when you want it to carry the full weight of a specific moment, when the words are doing extra work. "I love you," she said back, without hesitation, and she picked the mending back up because that was who she was, and he went back to the harness leather. And the fire burned, and the children moved in the room, and the baby slept, and the wind moved over the hard-won land outside, and everything was exactly what it should be. The spring of 1878 brought the news that Hale Patterson's dry goods store had failed, the result of bad debts and a poor decision to overextend on inventory, in advance of a market that did not materialize. Patterson left Harlan's Crossing in April without much ceremony, and Myrtle heard about it from Tom Haskell and felt nothing particular about it, which was, she reflected, the appropriate response. The man had tried to take her land and had failed and was gone, and she had other things to attend to. What she was attending to, that spring, was the question of a proper school for the children. Henry was 15 and Pearl was 13, and their mother's teaching had taken them a considerable distance. But there was a limit to what could be accomplished without better books and a qualified teacher, and the kind of socialization that came from being educated alongside other children. The school in Harlan's Crossing had been intermittently operational for 3 years, dependent on whatever itinerant teacher passed through, and was not reliable enough for Myrtle's purposes. She raised this matter at the county board meeting in March, which she attended because Calvin had suggested, and she had agreed, that they ought to be more engaged in county governance. She raised it with the same direct precision she brought to all problems, presenting the case for a permanent school teacher and a reliable school year in terms of what it would cost, what it would return in terms of a better educated county population, and what the neighboring counties were doing that Colton County was not. The board was composed of 7 men of varying degrees of vision and practicality. 3 of them listened with genuine interest. 2 were skeptical on cost grounds. 1 was openly dismissive, a man named Ferris who ran a small cow and calf operation and held the established view that too much schooling spoiled working children. The 7th, Judge Webb, who had handled the title matter with competence and had since proven himself to be genuinely interested in the county's development, said that the widow Sutton, or Mrs. Granger, he apologized, had raised a point that the board ought to take seriously. By May there was a properly hired teacher in Harlan's Crossing, a young woman of 23 named Miss Holloway who had trained in Austin and who arrived in town with 2 trunks of books and an absolute lack of patience for the idea that children in small towns needed less education than children in cities. Henry and Pearl and June rode to school 3 days a week, which was what could be managed given the farm work, and came home on those evenings with the bright, keyed-up energy of people who have been given more to think about than they can process in one afternoon. Henry, in his 3rd month of school attendance, told Myrtle that Miss Holloway had explained a system of crop rotation used in Missouri that he wanted to apply to the sorghum field, and presented her with a written plan. Myrtle read the plan, made 3 comments about water management that Henry incorporated, and approved it. Calvin added that he thought the principle was sound, and that they might look at integrating a winter cover crop as well, which led to a three-way discussion at the supper table that lasted through the washing up and into the early evening. Pearl was corresponding, via letters that Miss Holloway helped her address correctly, with the Agricultural College in Austin, following up on her mother's original inquiry from years before with questions about soil chemistry that were, as Miss Holloway told Myrtle privately, considerably beyond what she herself had studied. In the summer of 1878, Calvin made the decision to sell the main Granger Ranch property to Doss, his foreman, who had been effectively running it for 2 years and who had the desire, and with Calvin's fair terms, the means to take it on fully. It was not an easy decision, but it was a right one. Calvin's life was on the farm now, not on the cattle operation, and the farm had grown to the point where it needed his full attention to continue developing. Doss was a good man who would take care of the land and the animals, and who would be a good neighbor. The sale was completed in August, and Calvin stood on the porch of the farmhouse on the evening after the papers were signed and looked out at the sorghum, which was nearly ready to cut, and felt the particular completeness of a man who has decided correctly and knows it. Myrtle came and stood beside him, and he put his arm around her without looking away from the field. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "Not as much as I expected to," he said. "The land won't miss you," she said. "This land, I mean. It won't let you go." "No," he said, "it won't." He tightened his arm around her. "Neither will you, I hope." "No," she said firmly, "neither will I." The harvest of 1878 was the best yet, the result of Henry's rotation plan, and the new well and 2 growing seasons of the deep-tilling method, and the accumulated improvements of 5 years of careful, intelligent work. The sorghum yield was enough to supply both the Abilene feed supplier and a new contract Calvin had arranged with a molasses producer in Fort Worth, who had been looking for a reliable West Texas sorghum source. The pigs numbered 8 now, and the proceeds from the fall market were enough to begin the construction of a proper frame house, to replace the sod house that had sheltered the Sutton family through the hard years. The decision to build the frame house was one Myrtle considered for longer than Calvin expected. He had suggested it in the spring, and she had said she would think about it, and when he came back to the subject in July, she was still thinking. "It's a good house," he said, meaning the sod house. "It kept my children alive through 2 bad winters," she said. "I don't want to forget what that felt like." "We can keep the original walls," Calvin said after a pause. "Build the frame around them. The sod is good insulation in any case. We don't have to tear it down." Myrtle looked at him with an expression that was something between surprise and deep warmth. "That is a very good idea," she said. And so the frame house was built around the bones of the sod house, the new rooms extending outward and upward from the original walls, so that the heart of the building was the thing Myrtle had built with her own hands in the worst year of her life, and everything else grew from it, which was exactly how she wanted it. By the time the house was finished in the fall, Myrtle had something else to tell Calvin, which she did in the same direct, plain way as before, and his face did the same thing it had done before, and they held each other in the new kitchen of the new house, which still smelled of fresh lumber and river clay, with the same fierceness as the first time. The second baby was born in April of 1879, a girl this time, small and determined-looking, with brown hair and gray eyes that combined both her parents in a way that seemed, to everyone who looked, like an argument made in flesh for the rightness of some things. They named her Clara, because Myrtle had loved the name for 20 years and had never had cause to use it, and because it suited the child from the first evening of her life. Young Declan, a year and a half old, regarded his new sister with the cautious interest of a small person encountering something that has claimed some of his resources and is not entirely sure what to do about it. And then, over the course of the following weeks, became fiercely protective of her in the way that small children sometimes become fiercely protective of smaller things, so that he would place himself, wobbling but determined, between Clara's cradle and any draft or loud noise, as if he personally were the solution to all problems. Henry was 16 now and had his father's height, or what Myrtle imagined Declan's height might have become if he had lived, and was managing the greater part of the farm's field work. He had been corresponding with the agricultural college himself, entirely on his own initiative about their program of studies, and had quietly asked Myrtle one evening, in the way of someone who has thought about something for a long time and is now being careful about how they say it, whether she thought it was possible that he might go to Austin someday. Myrtle looked at her son, who was sitting at the table where he had once done lessons by candlelight when there was nothing in the larder but salt pork and dried beans, and who was now a young man of evident capability and considerable intelligence, and she said, "I think that is absolutely possible, and I think it is what should happen." Calvin, who was present at this conversation, said that the agricultural college had a practical studies program that allowed students to apply learning directly to their own land operations, and that he had, entirely by chance, a contact at the college through the Fort Worth molasses connection, and that he would be glad to write a letter if that was useful. Henry looked at Calvin with a directness that was very much his mother's and said, "That would be useful, thank you." Calvin nodded and Henry nodded, and that was the whole of the exchange, but it was complete. Pearl, at 14, had decided that she was going to be a doctor, which was in 1879 a decision of considerable audacity for a girl in West Texas. But Pearl had always had her mother's quality of refusal, the absolute refusal to accept a conclusion that was not hers, and she stated her intention with the same tone she used when explaining crop rotation to a skeptical farmhand, which was to say a tone of complete reasonableness that somehow made disagreement seem like the unreasonable position. Miss Holloway, who had by now been teaching in Harlan's Crossing for over a year and had developed a particular investment in the Sutton, now Granger, children, told Myrtle privately that Pearl was the most naturally scientific thinker she had ever taught, and that she had written to a colleague in San Antonio about schooling options. Myrtle, who had taught herself everything she knew about soil chemistry and water management and agricultural economics from pamphlets and circulars and letters to government offices, received this information about her daughter with a fierce, quiet pride. June, who was 8, had collected and pressed and catalogued over 60 varieties of plants from the county, including 6 that Miss Holloway said she could not identify from her own references, and had submitted them to the agricultural college with a careful handwritten description of where each one had been found and what the soil conditions were at that location. The college had written back to express interest and to ask several follow-up questions, and June had answered them with the methodical thoroughness of a person who has never experienced the concept of a question too large to pursue. By 1880, the Sutton farm, which was now sometimes called the Granger place and sometimes called the Sutton Granger place, and which the Myrtle, with the particular stubbornness of a woman who has earned the right to name things, continued to call the Sutton place in honor of Declan, had become one of the most productive small farm operations in Colton County. It was not the largest. It did not compete with the big cattle ranches on acreage or raw revenue. But for the quality of what it produced per acre of worked land, for the intelligence of its management, for the range of its crops and the reliability of its yields, it had no equal in the western section of the county and possibly in a larger radius than that. Old Tom Haskell, who had been the person to tell Myrtle about the Alkali Creek in those first terrible weeks, came to her one afternoon at the feed store and told her, with the gruff affection of a man who had watched something extraordinary happen and is finally saying so, that she was the best farmer in the county and had been for at least 3 years, and he reckoned most people knew it by now. "Most people," Myrtle said. "All right, all people," Tom said, "including Ferris, and you know what it costs him to admit anything." Myrtle bought her salt and her flour and her seed corn and drove home in the October afternoon with the wind behind her and the sorghum cut and the new well turning in the north pasture, and Clara asleep in the wagon bed and young Declan sitting beside her talking to an entirely imaginary horse with total seriousness. And she felt, in the full and unguarded way she had not let herself feel since before Declan died, genuinely and completely at peace. Calvin was on the porch when she drove in. He had been repairing the porch rail, which had worked loose in the last wind, and he came down to take the horses when he heard the wagon and lifted Clara from the wagon bed without waking her and carried her inside. Myrtle unharnessed the wagon and led the horses to the barn in the late afternoon light that came across the Caprock flat and turned everything gold and long-shadowed. And she thought about the day she had stood in this yard, newly widowed, with $47 and 3 children and 2 chickens and a mule, and heard a man say in public that this land could not be worked, and had decided, with no particular drama and no heroic speech, simply that he was wrong. She had been right. Calvin came back out of the house and walked across the yard toward her with his hat tipped back and his sleeves rolled up, and the particular unhurried ease of a man who is exactly where he intends to be. "Tom Haskell called me the best farmer in the county," she told him. Calvin stopped and considered this. "He's not wrong," he said. "No," Myrtle agreed, "he is not." Calvin reached her and she lifted her face to him and he kissed her with the ease and warmth of a man kissing his wife at the end of the day, familiar and genuine and entirely without performance. "Henry got a letter," he said against her hair. Myrtle pulled back to look at him. "From the college," she said. "They're offering him a place in the practical studies program starting next fall," Calvin said. "Full consideration of his farm management record as part of the entrance requirements. He's been down there by the creek reading the letter for the last hour." Myrtle looked toward the creek, where the alkali water that had once seemed like a symbol of everything difficult about this place now ran through the channel she had dug and watered the garden and the orchard of 3 apple trees she had planted in 1877, because she had been told they would not grow there and had grown them anyway. She saw Henry, her tall, serious boy, sitting on the creek bank with a letter in his hands, reading it in the golden afternoon light. She went to him. He looked up when he heard her coming, and the expression on his face was one she recognized from 6 years before, when he had been 11 years old and harnessing a mule and running a farm with the patient gravity of someone who had accepted an enormous weight because he had no choice. And the expression was similar, the same fundamental Henry-ness of it, but the weight was different now. It was the weight of possibility, which is a very different kind of weight. "Ma," he said. "I know," she said, and sat down beside him on the creek bank. "I don't want to leave the farm," he said. "The farm will be here," she said. "It will always be here. It will be here when you come back with everything you learn." Henry looked at the letter and then at the creek and then at the farm spread out behind them, the long rows of sorghum stubble, the winter garden, the apple trees, the silver pump tower over the north pasture, the frame house with its sod heart. "He would have liked this," Henry said. "He meant his father." "Yes," Myrtle said. "He would have loved this." They sat for a moment with that, which was not grief exactly, but was the thing that lives next door to grief and is made of love. "Is Calvin going to be all right when I'm gone?" Henry asked, with the residual protective instinct of the boy who had once slept with his boots on. "Calvin is going to be perfectly fine," Myrtle said. "And you are going to be perfectly fine. And the farm is going to be perfectly fine. Your job right now is to go inside and tell your sisters and your brother about that letter before Pearl works it out from the expression on your face and beats you to the announcement." Henry stood up and looked down at her, and for a moment he was 4 inches taller than his mother and 11 years old and 30 years old all at once, and then he was just himself, 16 and certain of his direction, and he held out his hand and helped her up from the creek bank. "I love you, Ma," he said. "I love you, Henry," she said. "Now go." He went, long-legged and purposeful, across the yard, and Myrtle stood by the creek she had tamed and looked at the land she had made fertile and felt the fullness of the thing she had built. Not alone, not without help, but from the center of her own refusal outward, until it had become this farm and this family and this life. Calvin came to stand beside her presently, because he always seemed to know when she was somewhere meaningful and always came to be there with her, which was one of the many ways he expressed love without requiring words for it. "What are you thinking?" he asked. "I am thinking," she said, "that the worst land in the county is not the worst land in the county." "No," he said, "it never was. It was waiting," she said. "That is all. It was waiting for someone to stop believing what people said about it and start paying attention to what it actually was." Calvin took her hand and held it, and behind them in the house they could hear Pearl's voice rise with excitement about Henry's letter, and June's more measured response, and young Declan's contribution, which was enthusiastic and not entirely verbal, and Clara's distant baby commentary, which added nothing to the discussion but was present nonetheless. "We should go in," Myrtle said. "We should," Calvin agreed, but neither of them moved immediately, because the evening was clear and cool, and the last of the sun was on the sorghum stubble and the orchard trees, and the land was gold and quiet in the way it sometimes was at this hour, and it was worth a moment. Then they turned and walked together toward the lighted house, where the children were talking and the fire was warm and supper was yet to be made, and there was always more work, and it was the right kind of work, the kind that built something, and they went to it together, and the door closed behind them, and the lamp light reached through the windows into the dark, and on the hard-won land of the western edge of Colton County, Texas, everything was fully, completely, and without reservation good. The years that followed arranged themselves in the way that good years do, not in dramatic peaks, but in the steady accumulation of things working as they should. Henry went to the agricultural college in Austin in the fall of 1881, and came home with new ideas every visit, a long, lean young man who had his mother's soil knowledge, and was adding the theoretical framework to go with it. And he corresponded with Calvin and Myrtle between visits, with the detailed intensity of someone who cannot stop thinking about a problem he loves. Pearl pursued her education with Miss Holloway's help and the San Antonio connection, and the letters that came back from medical colleges were not yet offers, but were no longer dismissals, and Pearl's face during the reading of each one had the quality of a person making steady progress through determined terrain. June sent her plant catalogs to the agricultural college and received, in the fall of 1882, a formal letter of recognition from the college's botany department acknowledging her work, which she read 3 times and then pressed into the ledger beside Pearl's first entry. New Granger, estimated. Young Declan grew into a solid, cheerful, practical boy who had his father's steady gray eyes and his mother's quality of paying attention, and at the age of 5 declared his intention to run the farm someday, which Calvin said sounded exactly right. Clara, who was 3, had already demonstrated an aptitude for anything involving mathematics that Pearl assessed as extraordinary and documented in the ledger with the header, Clara G. observed capabilities, ongoing. And Myrtle Sutton Granger, who had buried a husband and a dream in the same hard fall, and had then proceeded to resurrect the dream on her own terms and by her own methods, who had proved wrong every dismissive certainty that had ever been directed at her land or her capabilities, who had raised 3 children in difficulty and was raising 2 more in abundance, who had built a farm where others had seen only failure, sat on the porch of her house in the evenings when the work was done and watched the sun go down over her fields and was not for a single evening, anything other than grateful. Grateful for the hard years, because they had made her certain of herself. Grateful for the land, because it had asked her best work and she had given it. Grateful for her children, because they were the finest people she knew. And grateful, with the full particular depth of a woman who had learned to love carefully and had discovered that carefully given love returns 100 times itself, for the man who had ridden over one spring afternoon to say he was wrong, and who had never stopped being right for her since. Calvin came out to the porch one evening in the summer of 1883 with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside her, and they looked at the farm together, the sorghum dark and heavy in the evening light, the apple trees old enough now to lean slightly in their permanent wind direction, the windmill pump standing its silver watch over the north pasture, the lights from the bunkhouse where the 2 hands they now employed were settled for the evening, the garden in its patient rows. "Do you know what I heard in town today?" Calvin said. "What?" Myrtle said. "Wilson Ferris told the feed store that the Granger operation was the smartest farm in 4 counties. Myrtle sipped her coffee. "Ferris," she said. "Yes," Calvin said. "He told the board meeting 10 years ago that too much schooling spoiled working children," she said. "He did," Calvin agreed. "All 3 of my older children are in school or have been in school," Myrtle said. "They are," Calvin agreed. "And the farm has never been better," she said. "It has not," Calvin said. They were quiet for a moment. "I expect he knows that," Myrtle said. "I expect he does," Calvin said. "That is probably why he said it." Myrtle smiled, and Calvin smiled, and the evening settled around them like something earned, and the land stretched out before them in all its hard-won beauty, green and silver and gold. And in the house behind them the children were the sounds and movements of 5 entirely individual lives taking shape, and the door was open, and the lamp was burning. And everything that had been built from $47 and a refusal to accept what people said about the worst land in the county was present and alive and ongoing. And it was, in every way that counted, more than enough. It was everything.